Good evening and happy Sunday. Thank you very much for joining me this evening for another episode of Sunday Night Magic. My name is Javi, and today is going to be a continuation of my series for my recommendations for Commander. So, for those of you who are not familiar, we are maybe on the fifth of 10 color combinations now that we've been talking about, where I've been sharing my Commander recommendations. And for today, it's very special. Today is the combination of red and blue. So, yeah, I gotta get these out of the way. I can barely see. So, all right. Before we get started, just a couple of promotions. Um, you can see right here. So, Card Core, my personal project for selling Magic singles. If you're looking for any specific Magic singles, please look us up. I can add you to our group chat, and we post cards for sale every day. And then right underneath that is the Guild of Mages. If you're looking for cards that are not available here in the local market and would like to consider purchasing it online, hit up the Guild of Mages, let them know I sent you, and they can assist you getting your order through Card Kingdom. So, with that out of the way, we're going to focus on today's topic. So, continuing the series again of my Commander recommendations, today is going to be focused specifically on the colors of red and blue, and that would be my top 10 Izzet or Prismari Commanders. All right, so again, going from previous episodes, the caveat here is that these commanders are strictly red and blue. They have to have both color identities. So I'm not going to be covering mono color, mono red, mono blue. That they basically have to represent both colors and would be recommended as a commander for your deck. So I'm not going to be able to use, let's say, planeswalkers that are not allowed to be as your commander. I'm going to be going through these my personal 10 choices that I'll be sharing with you. Don't consider this any definitive list, but maybe this would be great suggestions for anyone that is looking to build red and blue. This has been one of those pet projects of mine as well. I've built several different red-blue decks, and it's always been fun because it's a very high difficulty, high risk, high reward build that more often than not, it's always a glass cannon that it can one-shot the table, win as early as turn one. But if just one thing doesn't work, it could collapse and be a horrific experience for you. But I kind of take the challenge of rebuilding and trying to, beat those odds as a personal challenge, which is why I also really enjoy playing it. So before we get started, I see a couple of comments. So I'm just going to come in here. Okay. Yeah, these are special, man. I've had these for years. I love these things. But when you wear them too long, everything becomes black and white. All right. Yes, and thank you very much for joining, Chum. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I see a couple of people viewing. Thank you very much. If you have any feedback, any questions, anything that you'd like to add in, by all means, in between each of the rankings, I'll take a look at the comments and see if I can answer. So let's get started with today's list. Number 10 is a commander that I tried building one particular time, and unfortunately, it didn't quite work out the way I wanted, but there's no doubt that this commander could be a powerhouse if just used properly. This is Saheeli the Gifted. And this would be the one exception to our usual rule because Saheeli can be your commander as written on the bottom of the card. So like right here, the last line. All right, so Saheeli can be your commander. Typically, planeswalkers are not allowed to be your commander. This is an exception to the rule. So she is 4 to cast, which is 2 of any color, red and a blue. Fit the criteria perfectly. Planeswalker Saheeli. Her abilities are as follows. She can make 1/1 servo creature tokens, which means that she can protect herself by creating blockers. Where she really actually shines is her second ability, which is the next spell you cast costs 1 less for each artifact you control as you cast the spell. That will come into play later on when I'm explaining how you can really break this commander. So the final ability is that for each artifact you control, you can create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens have haste, and then they get exiled at end of turn. So you get a free copy of every artifact you own. So the deck encourages you to keep playing artifacts so that you can bring Saheeli down, and then essentially make spells cheaper so that you can bring in more artifacts. she's for the cast, which means that you will probably put down one or two artifacts before she even comes into play. Um, you may want to make a servo to protect her for the meantime, but once the round gets back to you and it's time to actually use her ability, red and blue have so much artifact manipulation, so much artifact generation. Like Sahili existed before the days of Dockside Extortionist, who could pretty much produce maybe like 6 treasure tokens in one go at a minimum. So that is a spell that would cost at least 6 less. You can put in artifact lands, just typical mana rocks, and you could pretty much get a discount of maybe 10 at the most, 10 colorless, or that even if it's at 5, but you still have the means to pay over that. Now, what are these spells that you want to cast that go over, or that would you want to get discounts on? You could definitely do something like extra turn spells, or something we featured in last episode. You can bring down the biggest creatures in Magic's history that can one-shot players. Blightsteel Colossus might even cost half its cost to bring it in. And once you get to Sahili's -7, you could make a second copy of the Blightsteel Colossus and kill 2 players simultaneously. Or, you know what? Cast Ulamog, destroy a permanent. And since since you have an early discount, you can essentially just hold back an opponent from even progressing further. And then future turns, you have Annihilator, which is just going to destroy everything in play. So Sahili actually, I believe, was on the verge or may have been banned in one-on-one Commander, but I don't play that particular format. In multiplayer, it's hard for her to defend herself. The moment she comes down, everyone has an idea of what she's capable of doing, and that one little colorless servo isn't really going to do much. So she needs a little bit more help in protection, and red and blue is not the colors for protection, to be honest. Like, they are aggressive and calculated, but oftentimes don't really have any creature base on the table. So that's the reason why she kind of made it to number 10. There's so much potential, but you have to really put in a lot of effort to protect her. But if you do, you can pull off some of the biggest spells in Magic and pretty much just destroy the table effortlessly. So number 10, Sahili the Gifted. Before we move to the next commander recommendation, let's go to the comments. All right. Hey, hi Denmark. Thank you for joining. I hope you enjoy this episode. And KO, yes. So Sahili is from the Kaladesh cycle or block of Magic, which is all about artificers. It was more or less kind of built in a way that it was like a desert setting, so to speak. Think of like pod racing from Star Wars Episode 1, even though people shouldn't remember that piece of crap movie. But, it's really built around artifacts and vehicles and making servos. So she was a perfect fit. She didn't really play a big role in terms of the overall story, but I think Sahili has a lot of potential. There's maybe, I'm going to say, 3 or 4 different versions of her that exist, and thus far they've all been pretty good. If you have a specific deck build for her, she does nothing but complement the rest of the 99. So something to consider when building. So let's move to number 9. Number 9 is actually one of another very strange direction that you can take with red and blue. So red and blue is Izzet, the Izzet League, which was based from the dragon Niv-Mizzet, the Draco genius that Magic decided to make a faction that was specifically about reckless experimentation, high risk, high reward. And later on, they developed also the School of Prismari, which is the theatrical magic group. So it's interesting how red and blue can actually apply on both, because one is like so passionate about the arts and expressing themselves, while the other one is also just so totally reckless in their pursuit of knowledge that they work really great. But somewhere in the middle, they did make other red and blue creatures. I mean, Sahili is not affiliated with any of these factions, but one that comes to mind here is Ludovic Necro Alchemist. So actually, by the way that you read it, Necro Alchemist kind of made me feel that he would be more suitable for black. But for a 3 to cast, 1/4, he can take a hit. He's not gonna die, but he's also not exactly an attacker. So he usually is just gonna sit back. But the advantage that he brings here is that at the beginning of each player's end step, so before every player ends their turn, that they can draw a card if they attack the player other than you. So it incentivizes all of your opponents to fight each other instead of you so that you get to draw a card. You can technically swing in with a 1/4 or whatever else you have to get a few damage in so that you get to draw. So from the previous commander recommendation, Sahili doesn't necessarily have the best protection. That's something that Ludovic brings in. He encourages people to attack other players, which takes that threat away from you. So, you could actually maybe put him in the 99 for Sahili if you'd like. But one other thing that you want to consider is that he has the ability of partner, which means that you can pair him off with a different partner and add in other color combinations. So you can build up to a maximum of 4 colors into one deck, with red and blue already being covered by Ludovic. So he's pretty good. He doesn't have any like infinite combo looped onto him. He's not a threat on the board. So that's kind of why he made it to number 9 on my list. That he has potential. He has his use. He's definitely good at diverting attention away from you. But at the same time, it's not exactly a game-breaking commander. But, still something that I would recommend people try to pilot. So number 9, Ludovic Necro Alchemist. Moving on, we're going to go to number 8. I don't see any comments, so we can skip through that portion. Number 8 is one of the new legendary creatures that came out of Modern Horizons 2, and is something that I've been really meaning to experiment with, and this is Yusri Fortune's Flame. So Yusri is a 3 to cast 2/3, so similar to Ludovic, 3 to cast 1/4, so this is 2/3. But what makes Yusri a little bit more useful is that he is flying, so he has evasion. It's actually kind of tricky to block him, and you don't actually want to kill players with combat, but you just want to attack with him and get through and survive the fight. Because when Yusri attacks, choose a number between 1 to 5. You are allowed to flip that many coins. For each win, you get to draw a card, and for each loss, you take 2 damage. Okay, so you could potentially lose 10 life. It's very high risk and very high reward with potentially drawing 5 cards for a single attack. So it's a perfect definition of what red and blue is. You can get so much resources, or it can hurt you so bad if you don't do it right. But you know what? If you manage to win the 5 flips this way, you can cast spells from your hand without paying their cost. So not only do you draw 5 cards, you could potentially just cast them all for free. So you want to find a way to manipulate the coin flips here so that you can get the most out of it. And that's where these cards come into play that I think really change the way that Yusri plays. So you can bring in Kark's Thumb, which says that if you would flip a coin, you flip 2 instead and ignore one of them. So you basically get to choose the result and win. Unless you flip 2 failures, all right, you can't do anything about that. But that still technically skews the coin flips to your favor. Then bring in another card like Chance Encounter, and I really that is usually in the artwork. I mean, it's part of the flavor text as well. Whenever you win a coin flip, put a luck counter and Chance Encounter. If you have 10 or more luck counters on it, you win the game. So you don't even have to win by the usual means that you would for Magic. You just have to flip and win 10 coin flips, and that's it. You win. Now, that might be tricky, but remember that we are talking about red and blue. Red and blue magic have the shared effort of manipulating so much in terms of extra turns and extra combat. Remember, use 3 triggers when he attacks. So if you attack and win 5 flips, okay, and then you will cast an extra turn spell or an extra combat spell, you could essentially flip again, and you just have to win a total of 10 and make it to your next upkeep, which is what extra turn spells are for. And using manipulation tools like Kark's Thumb, it's actually very easy to pull this off. Now, you could potentially shoot yourself to death with the 2 damage, but there are other ways to mitigate that. There are ways to gain life, there are ways to prevent damage, but essentially, Yusri could win in a single attack if you have all of the right pieces in play. So I've been wanting to build this and experiment with the deck. I've watched YouTube videos of other players try this out in pods, and it can get painful if you're not playing it right. But at the same time, it can end the game really, really quick. So, if you like that high risk, high reward strategy, if you like coin flipping, definitely consider using Yusri Fortune's Flame. So that was number 8. Going to check on comments. No, we're good with comments. All right, let's move on to the next. Number 7 is also pretty much a staple, I would say, these days of red and blue. The namesake of the school of Prismari. Number 7 goes to Galazeth Prismari. So all of the schools in Strixhaven, so specifically this school of Prismari, is named after an elder dragon. So this elder dragon is Galazeth Prismari. For the cast, 3/4 flying. Galazeth comes in and gives you a treasure token. So you can technically use the treasure token immediately, which means that Galazeth only really costs 3 if you think about it. Or you can use the secondary ability on the bottom that says artifacts you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana to cast instants or sorceries. So that treasure, you can actually even use it for instants and sorceries without having to sacrifice it, which is amazing. The trick is you are kind of pigeonholed into instants and sorceries. But red and blue is a perfect spell slinging deck. So it fits right into what they want to do. They barely have creatures. They have majority of just sorceries and instants anyway. Now, there's a lot of comparisons to a existing commander that is, I would say, broken beyond belief, and that is Urza Grand Artificer. And I'm not going to get into that for this particular episode. I did discuss Urza in the Simic episode briefly, but since he is mono blue, I'm not going to go there, and he does have abilities outside of what Galazeth does. So let's focus on Galazeth instead. Basically, you have a 3/4 flyer, which is fine. You may not necessarily want to attack and kill players. Now, getting a treasure is fine. You might need it for something. You never know. But the last half of the card that says artifacts you control can tap, you can technically cast much larger spells using artifacts that weren't even intended to be used for mana. And that's where the strategy for Galazeth comes in. I present to you 2 cards that, on face value, might not make any sense, but when you read the very first line of these cards, you'll understand. Winter Orb and Static Orb both have the very first sentence on both the card that say that as long as Winter Orb is untapped or as long as Static Orb is untapped, players cannot untap more than 1 land, players cannot untap more than 2 permanents. This punishes the entire table that players cannot untap, they cannot regain resources. You are essentially locking down the table and slowing it to a grinding halt. But this only works if they are untapped. So, right before it the turn goes back to you, use Galazet's abilities to tap an artifact and make 1 mana of any color. Okay? What do you use the mana for? I don't care. The whole idea is that you tap these things down, which means that during your turn, you get a full untap of every resource you have, while your opponents don't. So it breaks parity and it is so oppressive. This is something that Urza, Grand Artificer, was well known for, and it's really part of the archetype. But what Galazet brings in here is the addition of red. Red has so much abilities that can recur and bring back artifacts that were broken, and even give you so much more treasure that even if you don't tap the artifacts, you can use the treasures as if they were mana rocks without even sacrificing them. Galazet has a lot of potential in the build of control, which is funny that, technically he's supposed to be the representative of a house of theater students, that expressive artsy students, but his playstyle really leans more towards being controlling, that denying your opponent's resources by abusing his ability. I don't know how he plays out in standard, but in Commander, you definitely want to lock down the table. And it's impressive what he can do in the right circumstances. And the fact that he only costs 4, you can get him down pretty quick. And the 3/4 flyer is still a pretty decent blocker. So definitely something that I think that players should consider. Number 7, Galazet Prismari. And let's jump into some comments. Hey, yes, this is what we would call Prismari stacks. And what makes it really good is that it does have red. Most stacks decks would always be maybe blue and white. So having red effects like Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon, or even other more taxing effects like pyrostatic pillars or something like that, it becomes an option for you when you're moving into red. And I think one of the really good ideas that you could do is pretty much use artifact control. You can use spells or creatures like Goblin Welders to bring artifacts from the graveyard back in, and using Galazet, control it again so that you always break parity. All right. Are there good proliferate cards in Izzet for chance? Yes, there's actually several. So there are blue enchantments that automatically proliferate. And then there are also just blue spells that let you draw cards and proliferate. I don't know if red has any good ones, but blue definitely does. So that is something that you could consider also as an alternate way of increasing luck counters on the chance encounter spell. So that's a very good question, and I will look into that. I don't primarily use proliferate, only because you get 1 instance of that counter. Now, if you just use extra turns and extra combat, you could multiply the number of luck counters that you produce. You just have to be careful with failing the coin flips, because 2 damage per failure stacks up pretty fast. All right, so let's move on. Now, taking Saheeli earlier, that you can pretty much cast spells cheaper, the next commander is something that I've seen in action several times, and it's a little bit more niche, but something I think players would like to consider. This is Mizzix of the Iz Magnus. So he was introduced in the commander sets as well. He is a goblin wizard and basically a for the cast 2/2 goblin wizard. His abilities use a mechanic that they introduced in 2015, which is the experience counters. So whenever you cast an instant or sorcery with converted mana cost greater than the number of experience counters that you have, you get 1. So with nothing, basically to start off, you have 0 experience counters. You play a 1 to cast instant or sorcery, you get a counter. Then you do two, you do three, you do four, you do five. You pretty much progress that. And what is the point of having these experience counters? And take note, it says you get an experience counter. So even if Mizzix dies, you still keep the age counters. They never go away. They're not targetable for any reason. So you can bring Mizzix back in with different means, pay the commander tax, or do whatever you need to do. But once he's in, instants and sorcery spells that you cast cost one less per experience counter you have. So maybe get up to 4 or 5 counters on it, and every spell that you have is -5. What do you want to cast? The biggest instants and sorceries that you can think of. Time Stretch costs 10. You could potentially cut this in half or even more and just pay the 2 blue and take 2 turns afterwards. Or Enter the Infinite, which costs 12. Might just cost you 4 blue if you play the right sequencing of spells with Mizzix. And pretty much drawing your entire library except for 1 card, you should be able to win at that point. There is no more reason to continue playing. So Mizzix gives you the ability to play the biggest spells that you have at a discount. And that's really something that I've seen in several tables and pods that I've played. Our good friend Leomar runs this to perfection, and it's surprising just how cheap spells can get eventually. It's the build up itself is something that people on the table will not notice. They know what the end goal is, but it's really surprising to see that in a single turn you can bump up 2 experience counters and then just take an extra turn after that, and suddenly you go up to like 3 or 4 experience counters, and every spell they have is almost free, which is busted beyond belief. Now, the only reason why I put him in number 6 is that you kind of really have to build up to that point. You're not going to win immediately. So you have to pay, or you have to cast spells in increasingly higher costs for you to get these experience counters. So it's not as fast as most decks would be, but it's one of the funnest spell slinger decks that you're ever going to try. So number 6 goes to Mizzix of the Izzet. All right, couple of comments. All right. Oh, hey, thank you. Hi, Mars. So red has Volt Charge. That's true. Very good point. So yeah, there you go, chum. One red spell that we might be able to recommend. If I remember it correctly, I think Volt Charge also just costs 3 to cast. So thank you for the comment, Mars. Much appreciated. I hope you're enjoying the content. So moving on to my next commander recommendation. This one was a bit of a pet project that I really had fun with, and I think a lot of players may be able to appreciate this card now, specifically because Hull Breacher is no longer allowed or is banned from Commander. This is Riel the Everwise. So Riel was introduced in the Icorius set. She is 3 to cast, she is 0/3. Well, 3 to cast is perfectly fine. It's serviceable in a way that you could probably get her down maybe as early as turn 2, or even 1 if you're really lucky. But you need very specific cards for this to happen. Riel gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. So you're rewarded for having a graveyard. But more importantly, whenever you discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, you get to draw that many cards. So red and blue have so many loot effects that you throw away a card to draw a new card. But technically, Riel's ability replaces the card that you also threw away. You essentially draw double. To put this in context, one of the biggest problems or discussions that are happening now in Commander is that people are, there were rumors going around about wheel spells such as Wheel of Fortune and Windfall potentially being banned. I mean, they eventually just went with Hull Breacher. But if you read these cards correctly, take Wheel of Fortune for example. Each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Let's say that you were holding a full 7. When you discard that, you draw 7. Riel's ability says when you discard one or more cards in a single turn for the first time, draw that many. So you will draw another 7. You essentially get 14 cards. She breaks parity in a way that doubles the effect of what you draw if you time it right. Now, not every wheel is gonna go through. These are kind of the cards that people watch out for. They want to keep what's in their hand. So I kind of found a way to actually work around that instead. One of the cards that I found, which was a perfect pairing with her, and with another complementary card, is actually Ghostly Pilfer. Ghostly Pilfer, I don't even necessarily care about what he himself does, but there is some benefit to it. So he's 2 to cast to 1. You have a pretty much a ghost that whenever he becomes untapped, you can pay 2. If you do, draw a card. Oh, okay, so he is a draw engine if you're willing to pay. Now, whenever an opponent casts a spell from outside or other than their hand, draw a card. So if they cast their commander, you get a card. That's great. But his last ability says discard a card and he can't be blocked. So in every turn of your opponents, you can discard a single card that you don't care about from your hand, and Riel will replace it. Essentially, without doing anything at all, you can, in one turn cycle, draw an additional 4 cards every turn just by having him standing there. So it's not as powerful as a wheel effect, but it also really just goes under the radar because people don't realize how you're abusing that. Now, throw in cards like Squee, which I talked about in our last episode, that he just keeps coming back to your hand. He pretty much replaces himself. You could eventually draw out your deck, but you are also pretty much filtering to the pieces that you really want to keep. So, Riel has a lot of potential. And even at a late game, that having, let's say, I think at one particular game, I built her up to like an 8-3. 8 damage is nothing to make fun of. You can essentially get to commander damage and one-shot a player if you do it right. So she even just has that aggressive side that if you really need it, it's there. Otherwise, you can just really have her sit in the back. You discard cards and you pretty much draw double for those effects, which is impressive. So, something to think about. I mean, I enjoyed playing Riel a lot. Unfortunately, when people figured out what she does, they didn't let me survive any games. So, word of warning, once you build this deck, it's gonna draw a lot of ire on the table, and good luck with that. So before we move on to the next one, let's see. I do see a comment up here. All right. Oh no, so this is going back to Volt Charge. Okay, thank you, Mars. So let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is a commander favorite. I have not played this commander as I haven't built the deck yet, but I have played against this commander several times, and it's actually pretty fun, but it's also very expensive in terms of casting costs. So I would say it's actually a little slow, but throw some money at that deck, you can make it lightning fast. And this is the Locust God. So introduced in the Ikoria set, the Egyptian theme set of Magic, the Locust God is 6 to cast, which is a little too expensive in my opinion. He is a 4/4 flyer that has the following abilities. Whenever you draw a card, you make a 1/1 red-blue insect. Apparently, locusts are red and blue in Magic lore, which doesn't necessarily make any sense, but it is what it is. Next is that he has the ability to pay 4, 2 and a red-blue. You draw a card, then discard a card. Discard effect, again, could pair with Riel if you wanted to. Now, if you also happen to lose the Locust God, if he dies, return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. So he actually also dodges commander attacks. He could essentially always be six to cast if people keep repeatedly killing him, unless they go with exile effects. That is not die, that goes back to the command zone. But he does have a little bit of, not necessarily evasion, but at least a way to evade commander attacks. But what you really want from the Locust God is whenever you draw a card, red and blue have so many draw effects that you are going to essentially build a swarm. You can take down opponents with a bunch of 1/1s, or you could take it further and just add in two very, very specific cards to this build. We are looking at Ashnod's Altar and Skull Clamp. Ashnod Altar says that you can sacrifice a creature to get two colorless mana. Skull Clamp says equipped creature gets +1/-1, and if that creature dies, you draw two cards, and it costs one to equip. Now, this is gonna take a little bit of math and a little bit of like, I don't know, I guess mathematic gymnastics, but follow along with me just for a minute. Assuming you have like two insects in the game, okay? Sacrifice one to Ashnod's Altar, and you have two colorless mana. Spend one of them to use the Skull Clamp on the second insect, okay? It dies, and you draw two cards. So now, since you drew two cards, you get two insects because of the Locust God. And you still have one colorless mana floating. Rinse and repeat. You will have infinite colorless, and you will pretty much draw out your entire deck. Now, what you do with the infinite colorless is up to you, but you should basically be able to win now that you've drawn your entire library. So without even using any of these 1/1s for combat purposes, that you could go with the non-aggressive approach and sit back and have them as blockers maybe, but then eventually just sacrifice them all, draw your entire deck, and win. It's that simple. So, I've played against the Locust God, and I've not lost to the Locust God yet, because of the cost of being six to cast, a lot of exile spells being in the game. Red and blue does have a little bit of a problem in terms of protection. I mean, you have counter spells and such, but you also tend to reserve that really for when you need it. So, there is a build in it. You can run infinite, but you do need some pieces. You need certain things in play, like, okay, two existing insects, the two artifacts, and maybe a little bit of mana, and also hopefully that you don't draw yourself dead. So, I still think that it has so much potential. And the fact that you're drawing cards, he has a built-in draw effect. It's pretty impressive how they got everything together, and how, the Locust God existed before Commander really took off. So this whole ability of him going back to your hand and essentially dodging commander attacks is something that I don't think they could have predicted being that useful, but it is. It's very useful. So it's something to be considered. Number 4, the Locust God. Back to some comments. Yes, Ikoria is the Godzilla set. That is correct. But for the human faction, they introduced red, white, and blue as having the humans that would bond with the monsters of Ikoria. The Godzilla part was just a little bit of like a side art thing, really, for collector purposes. Yeah, you know what? Every time people see the Locust God, this is like everyone knows that this thing is good, but like I haven't really seen a lot of people pilot it. But again, there is the potential there. And to answer your question, no, the Locust God is not from Ikoria. He is from Amonkhet, the Egyptian themed set. So they introduced a whole group of gods in the Amonkhet set. That pretty much this was a specific world that was ran by gods for different beliefs. Oh, I did. If I mentioned Ikoria earlier, then that was my mistake. Thank you for correcting me. All right. Wow, I'm being monitored by Denmark. All right, so let's move on. Number three, similar to going through Galas at Prismari, the namesake of the School of Prismari. Number three goes to the namesake of the Izzet League. This is Niv Mizzet. This is the third iteration of him, though. So this is the Perun, which is more of like it is a leadership role that they introduced in the whole Ravnica story block. But basically, there have been two different versions of Niv Mizzet in the past. One was actually really good, but this version is just leaps and bounds better. So he is a 6 to cast, which is very expensive. And what makes it worse is that it costs 3 red and 3 blue. So it's very, very mana intensive to get him down, but it cannot be countered. That's the very first line of text on that card. So you cannot stop Niv Mizzet from coming in. Next, he is a 5/5 flyer. That's still pretty good. So he's a good blocker and he's a good attacker. Perfect definition of what red and blue is all about. Now, whenever you draw a card, Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage to any target. So you're guaranteed at least 1 damage every turn based on your draws. How do you increase the draws that you have? His last ability. Whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, draw a card. Which is great, which means that even if somebody tries to kill Niv Mizzet using an instant or sorcery, you get to draw and potentially find something to save him with. But what you're actually trying to do is you want to do a draw loop with him. And just like the very first original Niv Mizzet Firemind card, there are curiosity effects. So the namesake of it is Curiosity. Now, there are other cards. There's technically 3 that exist that do this effect, and I chose to feature 2 of them here. The very first one is Curiosity. For 1 blue, you can enchant a creature. You put it on Niv Mizzet. It says, whenever enchanted creature deals damage to opponent, draw a card. Now, whenever you draw a card, Niv Mizzet deals 1 damage. When you deal a damage, you draw a card. When you draw a card, you deal a damage. It becomes essentially not really an endless loop, but for every card that you're drawing, he is dealing a damage. In Commander, you're playing 100 cards, so you have 100 damage to dish out. 40 for 2 players is 80. So then you have 20 left for another player, but you already have your starting hand and everything. So you could work this up to a way that you could kill 2 players maybe. Now, there are other effects like Tandem Lookout that does the exact same thing, but since it's creature-based, it's much more difficult to counter. The moment that you cast, let's say you have Tandem Lookout in the game, you cast Niv Mizzet, you can have the Soul Bond effect go online immediately. And the moment one opponent casts a spell, the loop begins. Even if they try to stop the loop, they're actually going to start it. So inadvertently, they're going to cause their own death. Unless somebody tries to kill the Tandem Lookout prior to Niv Mizzet coming in. So there are a little bit of hoops and hurdles here, but the fact that he's uncounterable and that you're pretty much going to draw your entire deck. So even if you don't finish your opponent off, or if you draw your entire library, you know what? It says there that whenever it deals damage to an opponent, for the final card, make him shoot himself. You're not going to draw anymore. And so you have everything else except 1 card maybe. So there is a way to stop the loop. Because Niv Mizzet says that he can deal damage to any target. Choose yourself and stop the loop and then flat out win. So there's a lot of potential with him. I've played against this deck several times and it is mana intensive, but I would say that it is so consistent and has so many different ways to pull off the victory that your opponents will find themselves in a situation where casting any instant or sorcery will mean their death. So it's a great control build also. And it really fits into the namesake of the Izzet League, which is Niv Mizzet, which is pretty much all focused on like high risk, high reward, explosive experimentation that, if you're not careful, could bite you and kill you, or could be something so lethal that your opponents can't do anything about it. So I personally really like playing Niv Mizzet. I don't run him as a commander. I put him in as a 99 because I play really more than two colors whenever I get the chance. But, if you are interested in building a deck and you like to draw cards and you don't really like the whole counter spell or being prevented from playing what you want to play, I suggest considering Niv Mizzet Perun. So before we move to number 2 and number 1, let's jump into some more comments. Okay. There you go. Yep. Niv Mizzet and Curiosity. Yes. So this is a well-known combination that a lot of players really know about and have been using several times. So, okay, you won't be able to stop the loop with Tandem because the card draw is not a May ability. No. So you see, the thing is, it says that, just to answer that question for you, Chum, these cards say that whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, so keep doing the damage to your opponent and keep drawing cards. When you get to the last card, Niv Mizzet says that he can deal damage to any target. Target yourself. And it doesn't meet the criteria anymore. So you won't draw that final card and kill yourself. So that's how you break that loop. All right. So thank you for the comments. I hope I was able to clarify that. It is something that a lot of people are not aware of. And that is one of the parts that kind of broke, I think, the very original Niv Mizzet, that players were drawing themselves dead, basically. Yes, because he damages any target. So all you have to do is break the opponent cycle, target himself. And he, of course, he's not his own opponent. And then suddenly the cycle breaks. You're holding on to all of your cards and just continue playing and win. So number 2 and number 1 were very difficult for me, to be honest. These two commanders are both commanders that I have built and used several times. One I'm currently using, actually. And the designing factor I decided to go with here or use is that one really strictly is red and blue. And that's why I decided to have them as number 1. But the number 2 that I'm also going to be talking about here is one of the best red-blue legendary creatures that you could be using. And that is Crom Ludovic's Opus. So Crom is a 5 to cast, 4/4 flying haste zombie horror. There's just way too much to take in there that it having a 4/4 flying haste means that he can attack immediately. I don't necessarily care about the zombie horror part. And it's so weird that zombie horror in red blue. Why is there no black in this? But, even the guy who made him, which is Ludovic, which we talked about earlier, is also red and blue. So I don't know. This is maybe a flavor miss from Magic the Gathering, but Crom has his use, and it's really, really good. So let me tell you why. Having a 4/4 flyer is a great blocker. And at the same time, having him have haste makes him also a potentially good attacker. 4 life loss, and that's also commander damage, is pretty good. He has partner, which means that you can combine him with other color combinations, bringing in more into your build. I currently run Chrome with Timna, so I am running black, white, red, blue. That's 4 colors, and that is what the original partner cards really have an advantage over other partner that they've introduced in the game. You pretty much get the best of all colors. Well, sans one color maybe. So that's why like I'm playing everything but green. Now, he's an attacker. He's a pretty good blocker. And if you just don't do anything with him, he has a second ability that says whenever an opponent casts his or her second spell each turn, draw a card. So when an opponent is just like playing mana rocks and creatures, you can get free cards. When two of your opponents are going into a counter battle trying to kill each other, you get to draw cards. So you actually get to fuel up with cards every 2 spells for every player every turn. So you can do the math here and see that you probably maybe draw an average of about 1 or 2 cards per player's turn, provided that they're casting at least 2 spells. Usually, when Crom comes down, the table becomes very conservative and tries sticking to 1 spell. So, okay, you're not drawing, but you're slowing everyone down, which gives you an advantage to break parity. You don't care about how many spells you're casting, while your opponents do. So, having an attacker, having a potential draw engine, and even just having a 4/4 flyer that would just maybe be defensive and just net you cards by standing back is a great addition or great commander to lead any deck. And then just throw in whatever other color combination you want to fit in. He doesn't have the infinite combo, but just having him in play can, break parity in terms of card draw. And that is something that I have found to be one of the most useful things that players are, looking for in like a competitive commander game. Now, in casual tables, maybe not so much, but again, 4/4 flyer, still a threat, and it really shows in most of the games that I've played with him. Now, I didn't choose him as number 1 mainly because he does open the avenue for other colors, which is what he really is about. He's not purely red blue. No one runs Chrome alone. Even Chrome Ludovic, which is pure red blue, I've never seen anyone do that pairing. You'll always introduce a different color to complement him, like such as myself, like playing red, white, black, blue. So that's what I decided to use as a factor to not make him number 1. And instead, my number 1 goes to a commander that has so many different builds and rewards players in a way that you can make an entire game group pretty much kick you out when you bring up this commander. I have ran this commander in 3 different versions and have been hated for all 3 times. And number 1 goes to Joyra, the Weatherlight Captain. This is the second version of Joyra that exists. The first one is pretty good but slow. But this is a 4-cast 3/3 human artificer. Okay. I mean, there are better creatures, sure. I mean, even Galazet was a 4-cast 3/4 and he came with a treasure. But whenever you cast a historic spell, the definition of historic is artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. They're all considered historic. I don't necessarily play sagas, so legendary and artifact, let's stick with that. Whenever you cast, which means that the spell doesn't even have to resolve, you just have to cast it, you draw a card. So the way that you build this deck is actually very, very interesting in that 1/3 of the entire deck costs 0 or maybe 1 mana and are mostly artifacts. You'll play 1 to draw a card, to play 1 to draw a card, to play 1 more artifact, and at ad nauseum, you just continuously keep casting everything that you are drawing. And when you have enough of it, You bring in spells like Herky's Recall or Retract that returns all of your artifacts back to your hand. And then you cast them all again and continuously draw again. This becomes a game of solitaire. Pretty much everyone else in the table is just going to watch you play cards over and over as you draw more and more. And why are you doing this? You're trying to build a spell count because you have storm spells like Grape Shot, for example. Here, there are other storm spells that you could be using, but Grape Shot would be the most straightforward one since you just deal damage to people based on the number of spells you played. Or Aether Flux Reservoir, which you gain a life for every spell that you've played this turn, and then you can pay 50 life and then deal 50 damage to a player. I have managed to pull off this Joyra loop as early as turn 2 or turn 3. So it is very, very lethal. She is a kill on sight commander that people hate. And the power that she brings, I mean, just being a 3/3 is pretty decent, sure. But the build, no other deck can survive on so many zero to cast cheap little artifacts, and even reward you. Like, you don't even need them to resolve, you just need to cast and you draw. So there are deck builds for her that are stacks builds that are oppressive as hell, or even just turbo draw decks, which is what I'm more familiar with, which is referred to as Cheerios because everything costs 0. There's a little bit of a combination of both. There are other storm effects that people like using, like Mind's Desire and other spells like that. I mean, that's not my particular playstyle, but the flexibility of just being rewarded for casting historic spells makes her so good and a really good representation of what red and blue is, because it's very high risk, high reward. You are essentially playing with near useless cards so that you can just keep drawing more useless cards to draw more useless cards and just build a spell count. So you're going to math the entire table out and pretty much, yeah, essentially piss everyone off, which I have done several times. And, it's not anything to be proud of, but that's what the deck does. And, not every deck will be able to stop or confront what Joyra does. And now that they've removed effects like Hull Breacher, which prevents players from drawing cards, she is viable again. So that's why I also wanted to put her in number 1. She's a perfect representation of red and blue. She is viable again since the whole draw less plays with Hull Breacher have been removed, and they're still introducing more and more artifacts and abilities that can help her. Having more treasure producers is just making it even stronger. So I am definitely, considering rebuilding this deck. But at the same time, I know every time I build it, I'm going to get like a collective groan from my game group. So I have to pick the time when to bring this out. But my number 1 for today's episode is Joyra Weatherlight Captain. And I hope that you consider maybe building Joyra to give it a try. You never know. You might actually enjoy it too. And if you're the type that likes pissing off your friends, go for it. So that is my top 10 Izzet and Prismari Commanders. Now, let me go ahead and just jump into some comments. Okay. There, see, yep, people remember. I remember, yes, a 30-minute turn of just me, just playing card after card and then sending it all back to my hand and doing it over and over again. And yes, the terminology is Cheerios because it's a deck that is primarily made of 0 to cast spells. Actually, very good point. Thank you for adding this. There are other YouTubers that have covered Joyra, and yes, Mitch from the Commander's Quarters did talk about this deck, and pretty much a lot of players have stopped playing Joyra mainly because of the effect that she has on the table, denying other players the opportunity to play Magic and just have them watch you for 30 minutes. It's a little rude. I mean, in a competitive scene, that's amazing. You have no choice. You're gonna torture your opponents. But in a casual table with friends, yeah, it kind of sucks that they're just gonna have to watch you. So, um, again, consider it if you want to try building it. And I think that, I mean, I personally enjoy playing it because it's a playstyle I love. I love drawing cards. I love spell slinging. And it's such a red and blue is a high difficulty glass cannon that can work and also fail miserably. So it depends on your play style. It depends on your play group. I mean, rule zero this stuff. Always ask people if will they play in a table with Joy or Weatherlight Captain. So if they say no, be prepared with something else. And I hope that the other commanders that I presented in today's list give you some idea of what you may want to build. Now, we kind of hit an hour mark. This may be one of the longest episodes I've had. I hope that you guys enjoyed the list that I presented today. My top 10 Izzet / Prismari Commanders. Thank you for the comments and feedback. If you have suggestions for what next color pairing you'd like for me to cover, we're 5 in. We have 5 to go, I believe. So I'm open to any suggestions, of course. And again, one more time, Cardcore. Look us up on Facebook. If not, message me directly. I'll add you to the group. Guild of Mages, if you're looking to order cards online. And of course, stick with Variable Play. Our network has so many different shows that you guys got to check out that, if you're not really into the Magic the Gathering content, there is still so much more that you can go into. We have news, we have solo gaming, we have game designers that are local game designers. We have game reviews and so much more content for you to check out. So again, thank you to everyone that stuck around for today's episode. Much appreciated. And again, keep gaming, guys.